When you hear the words, "when a stranger calls," what do you think of? Do you think of the movie that was released in the 70s? Maybe its remake from 2006? Or maybe you recall hearing the story at a slumber party in amongst all of the other ghost and spooky stories. I personally remember loving the When a Stranger Calls movie from 2006 back when I was younger. It was so much fun to watch, but the constant jump scares were a little bit excessive, but it definitely created a fear within me that made me a little apprehensive to continue babysitting anymore. And so for today, we are going to be diving into the urban legend of the babysitter and the man upstairs, which, in addition to just being an incredibly frightening story, also has roots in a true story, which is even more terrifying. This is the truth behind When a Stranger Calls. So if you are not familiar with the babysitter and the man upstairs story, better known as the When a Stranger Calls story, or you just need a refresher of it, here it is in summary. A teenage girl arrives at a house to babysit two children, whom the parents tell her are already asleep. So the parents leave and the girl begins doing homework and watching TV. Then the phone rings. The girl answers, but hears only heavy breathing in reply. So she hangs up, checks to ensure the front door is locked, and resumes her homework and TV show. Then the phone rings again. This time, a reply is given when she answers. A male's voice asks, "Have you checked the children?" She asked who the caller was, but he hangs up. After a little while, the stranger calls again and asks the same question. "Have you checked the children?" The girl knew she should go up and check on them, but at this point, she is too frightened to even move. She called the number the parents had left for her in case of an emergency, but they weren't picking up. The girl figures it's one of her friends trying to scare her, so she dials the operator and asks them to trace the call. And that's when the operator urgently tells her to leave the house and that the police are being sent over because the call is coming from inside the house. There are many variations as to the ending of this, but oftentimes it involves the children being murdered and the police entering the house just as the killer is coming downstairs with the intent to murder the babysitter as well. Other times the babysitter dies, other times she saves the children, etc., etc. But another variation of this story involves a babysitter not receiving any phone calls, but rather when entering and exiting the bedroom, this big clown doll always seems to be in a different position than it was before. So the babysitter calls the parents and asks if she can remove the clown doll from the bedroom, to which they proceed to tell her that they do not own a clown doll, and it is actually a murderer in disguise. It's been said that this urban legend reflects many anxieties that young teens feel as they are accepting more responsibilities as they're transitioning into adulthood. The girl in the story is not only left to fend for herself, but is also responsible for the safety of these young children, which some people say is hinting toward a dress rehearsal for motherhood, but take that as you will. And then furthermore, she is threatened through the phone, which is seen as the primary source of social communication for young teenage girls, which can be seen as being incredibly ironic.
One thing that's interesting about babysitting is that it doesn't increase your danger of being attacked at all. It would be a completely random event for a babysitter to be attacked during a house burglary. But it induces anxiety because suddenly they're responsible for these other people's kids. It has nothing to do with your potential for becoming a crime victim, but it may be getting expressed in stories in which the babysitter becomes a crime victim. What the babysitter and the man upstairs seems to be about is this warning about this kind of responsibility. If you're taking this responsibility, you have to take it seriously. So you have this voice that calls her up on the phone and almost like a conscience asks, "Have you checked the children?" And She hasn't checked the children, and that's one of the reasons why she doesn't know that they've been murdered.
There really is not a strong tradition in America of strangers coming in and killing babysitters. Babysitters killing small children, yes, but the stranger on babysitter story just doesn't connect up with a widespread, real social fear.
And what is even more chilling than the story of When a Stranger Calls itself is that this urban legend is actually based upon a true unsolved murder that took place in Columbia, Missouri, back in the 1950s. On March 18th of that year, a 13-year-old girl named Janett Christman was babysitting for the Romack family, where the 3-year-old son named Greg was already asleep with his radio on when she arrived. She was supposed to attend a party that was being thrown for the rest of her classmates, but Janett needed money to make the last payment on a new burgundy-colored suit that she had bought for Easter. The conditions outside made for a very spooky scene, as it was in the evening, it was cold, it was raining and sleeting outside, but other than that, everything seemed very normal for Janett. The Romacks lived in a one-story home atop a little hill just outside of town. And at this time, Mrs. Romack was pregnant, and it had been a long time since the two of them had been able to go out for a night, just her and her husband. So they were going to go out and play cards with their friends. And just before they left, when Janett arrived around 8 p.m., Mr. Romack apparently showed Janett how to load and fire his shotgun, and also instructed her to turn on the porch light before answering the door if anyone was to come knocking. Mrs. Romack called the house at one point just to check in and see how things were going, but she received a busy signal. However, she didn't think much of this. What Mrs. Romack didn't know was that just before she had made this phone call, at around 10:30 p.m., the police received a terrifying phone call that may have been from Janett. She was screaming, desperately telling the police to come quick, but unfortunately, police were not able to trace the call because no employees were working at the test board at the phone company that late at night, and they didn't even know the name of the girl who was calling. When the Romacks returned home around 1:30 a.m., they came upon a horrific scene. The front and back doors were unlocked, a side window had been broken, and Janett's body was laying on the floor with the phone off the hook nearby, which is why Mrs. Romack had gotten the busy signal when she'd previously called. All across 2 different rooms, there were signs of a violent fight.
Janett had skin under her fingernails. She had many abrasions on her body, but the final thing was that she was strangled with an ironing cord. I know she suffered a lot before she finally succumbed.
Unfortunately, not much is known about how the situation unfolded, but what is known for certain is that Janett was sexually assaulted and then strangled to death with an iron cord, likely by somebody that she knew, as the police were able to determine that the killer knew the inside layout of the house quite well.
If you see, there comes an offender. He breaks the window. The victim runs to the kitchen where the phone is, and he walks in through the front door. Now, why would he do that? He would do that only if he knew one detail. Ed Romack had shown her how to use the shotgun. He knew how long he would need around the house, through the front door, into the kitchen. So he knew every feet of the ground.
Thankfully, somehow the boy was completely fine. He had actually slept through this entire thing. The interesting thing to note here is that there is actually no evidence that whoever murdered Janett placed any calls to the Romack residence that night. So the infamous line, "the call is coming from inside the house," is more of a fabrication within the urban legend. However, at the same time, there is nothing saying that it didn't happen either. Inside the house, police collected bloody fingerprints, and bloodhounds searched the property when police discovered there were footprints in the sleet-covered ground outside, where they gained a scent for a little while through the bushes, but eventually lost the trail. Janett's friend, Anne Cornett, was visited by a police officer, asking about a recent trip the girls from her high school had taken to the quad at the University of Missouri to take some pictures. And oddly, he was asking if anyone had stalked or harassed these girls that day. And Anne replied no, other than what is unfortunately considered as normal catcalling. So the officer then asked for a picture that Anne had taken from that day. And the photo she presents is one of her and Janett Christman. And that was it. The officer didn't really go into more detail. Until the next day. The photo Anne had given him was plastered on the front page of the newspaper, along with the headline stating that Janett had been murdered. And obviously this rocked the entire community, with parents going so far as to try to shield their children from the details of the story. But of course, it could not be kept completely under wraps, and very quickly, her friends and classmates and members of the community were made aware of the horrific events that had taken place that March night. Furthermore, as in other cases that happen in small towns, doors began getting locked at night when previously they wouldn't be. Hardware stores were selling out of deadbolts and locks, and even mail carriers were saying that women were refusing to open their doors when they'd bring up packages. And not surprisingly, babysitters were becoming incredibly scarce on Saturday nights. So the police chief asked the public to be on the lookout and report to them if they saw anybody acting strangely, if they were missing work, or if they had any visible scratches or bruises on them. Police interviewed a number of men that they thought could potentially be the killer, and the most promising suspect was a 27-year-old named Robert Mueller, who was a friend of the Romack family. According to the testimony given by Mr. Romack, Robert Mueller had commented on Janett's well-developed form, and also made some unnerving advances toward Mrs. Romack a few days prior to Janett's murder, when he had apparently run his hand across her dress, describing Robert as a man who, quote, doesn't use his words, he uses his hands. Robert also knew that Janett would be babysitting at the Romack house that night because he had actually asked her to babysit his kid that night. And Robert was apparently at the same gathering that the Romacks would be at that night, but left a few hours in to apparently go and check on a doctor that was going to be coming to his house to tend to his son. And then Robert returned 2 hours later. But when the doctor was questioned about this, he said that he had never gone to Robert Mueller's house that night. And another interesting thing to note is that Robert Mueller was known to have carried around a mechanical pencil with him, which apparently matched the puncture wounds that were found on Janett's body. And I don't know if this is true, but I did read that Mr. Romack told police that Robert Mueller had told him at one point that he may have killed Janett, but just forgot about it. But the case that police were building against Robert Mueller was problematic, as the sheriff had apparently brought Robert to a farmhouse on the property of the deputy sheriff in order to question him all night, then bringing Robert to a lie detector test the next day, which Robert passed. But the prosecutor was not told about this, and an arrest warrant had apparently never been obtained for Robert either. And when this all went to trial, the grand jury decided that nothing could really happen to Robert Mueller due to the police and the sheriff department not working together and wasting time over what they called petty jealousies. And this mainly had to do with the city police showing up first on the scene, which they didn't have any jurisdiction over the area since the Romacks lived a little bit outside the city. Yet they still tried to take control of the investigation. This led to a lot of leadership battles, and the sheriff's department and police department were being completely uncooperative with one another. And everything that ensued in this tug of war is a little confusing, but regardless, Robert was let go and actually tried to sue the city police for violating his civil rights during questioning, which he lost, and then he later died in 2006. So if he did kill Janett, we will never know. A manuscript specialist at the University of Missouri named Mary Beth Brown did a large amount of research into this case and noted that there were a number of similarities between Janett's murder and the murder of a girl named Mary Lou Jenkins that happened only a few blocks away from the Romack house back in 1946. It was similar in that Mary Lou had too been strangled, but with an extension cord. 35-year-old Floyd Cochran had been arrested for murdering his wife 2 weeks later. He then tried to commit suicide, but survived and was taken into police custody. He then admitted to killing his wife. With this confession, he was then questioned for 10 hours about the murder of Mary Lou Jenkins, apparently making a number of incriminating statements, and then he just confessed to killing her, even though there was zero evidence connecting him to the crime. Floyd was sentenced to death on September 26, 1947, and a few hours before this was to happen, he recanted his confession, and it was later discovered that he had apparently been coerced into giving a false confession. But he'd already been executed in the gas chamber at this point, and Mary Lou's case is pretty much considered to be solved.
There were rapes that had occurred within that period between the Jenkins murder and the Christman murder.
Tell me about those.
Well, there was a rape that was within 2 blocks to the Christman murder. The girl was raped by a man that wore a mask.
Really?
And when you read the stories, the reports of the Christman murder, when they're talking about Robert Mueller, it turns out that he was interested in the theater and that he made masks. There was a black man named Jake Bradford that they charged, and he had already been in jail, and he was charged on the rapes.
You assume he was innocent?
Of that, they took the wrong man. They really did.
They were both young women. They were home by themselves. They were both found with electrical cords wrapped around their neck, but cords that weren't attached or torn from the appliance. They were actually cut. The whole location thing is the one that really gets me.
Like how close?
Within 2 blocks.
Do you think that the same person who killed Mary Lou Jenkins also killed Janett Christman?
That's my personal opinion, but yeah.
And who do you think did it?
I've been told several people, but more than any other name was Robert Mueller.
And that leaves us with no further information, with the main suspect in this case being released all those years ago and not even being alive anymore if Robert Mueller is responsible for the death of Janett Christman. The Romacks and the Christman family believe that Robert Mueller was responsible for Janett's murder, but unfortunately, whoever truly took the life of this independent, hard-working 13-year-old girl will for now remain unsolved, with the legend of the babysitter and the man upstairs that was based off of this tragedy living on.